Hello and welcome from me, Mike Scott in Oxford, and Michael Collins in Maryland, to the fourth event of 2025 in our Zoom season, Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we're bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, I'm pleased to be welcoming Bárbara Mujica, who will be talking about Don Quixote by Cervantes. Bárbara Mujica is a professor emerita at the Georgetown University, specializing in early modern Spanish literature, in particular, mysticism, women's writing, and theatre. Her book, Women and Religious Epistolary Exchange in the Carmelite Reform, won the 2022 Gemela Prize for the Best Book of the Year on Early Modern Hispanic Women. Her other books include Teresa de Avila, a Lettered Woman, and Women Writers of Early Modern Spain. Mujica is also a novelist whose book, Sister Teresa, was adapted for the stage by the Actors Studio in Los Angeles. Her novel, Frida, has been translated now into 18 languages. Just earlier this morning, it was only into 17, but I heard just a while ago that it is now also in Portuguese. She has also won awards for her short stories that have been published in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I gather that her novel, Mr. Rio, is to be made soon into a film. We're absolutely delighted that she's going to be with us today. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button, on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for our guest to answer. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. And with that, I'm looking forward greatly to Barbara's talk. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Cervantes begins Book One of Don Quixote in an odd way. Somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember, a gentleman lived not long ago. The narrator of the novel is clearly unreliable. He gives the reader no information about the protagonist. He is deliberately vague. Somewhere in a place whose name I do not care to remember, a gentleman lived not long ago. In fact, the narrator doesn't even tell us his protagonist's name. Some claim that his family name was Quijada, he says, or Quejada, for there is a certain amount of disagreement among the authors who write of this matter. The only significant information that the narrator gives us is that this gentleman was obsessed with novels of chivalry and intends to become a knight-errant himself in imitation of the heroes of his favorite books. By the end of the first chapter, the anonymous character has reinvented himself, taking a chivalresque-sounding name, Don Quixote de la Mancha, and acquiring the accoutrements of his new profession, armor, a horse, and even a lady on a pedestal. Shortly into Don Quixote's adventure, the narrator interrupts the story and leaves it pending because, he says, his sources provide no further information. The narrator finds the continuation of the would-be knight's tale in some notebooks he purchases in a marketplace, where a boy is selling a manuscript written in Arabic. Since the narrator doesn't read Arabic, he looks around for a Morisco, that is a Moorish convert to Christianity, who can translate it for him. It was not very difficult to find this kind of interpreter, he writes, an indication that in the marketplace, Moriscos were commonplace. The Morisco translator identifies the book as History of Don Quixote de la Mancha, written by Cide Hamete Benengeli, an Arab historian. In Book One, Cide Hamete is sometimes referred to as the second author. The choice of the fictitious Cide Hamete for the main source of Don Quixote's story reflects not only a reality of early modern Spain with its significant Moorish population, but it also serves Cervantes as a tool to explore some of the key issues of the novel: the interplay between perception and reality, fiction and history, concepts of truth, Spanish insularity, and racial bias. Throughout the novel, Cervantes humanizes and individualizes his Morisco characters, portraying them as complex individuals. However, from the perspective of the monarchy, Moriscos were simply the enemy, an insidious threat to the nation, and possibly clandestine allies of the Spaniards' most hated enemies, the Turks. The cultural encounter between the Moors and Gothic Spain began in 711, when the Berbers crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and defeated the Visigoth king Rodrigo. Southern Spain came under Muslim rule and became known as Al-Andalus, or Andalusia. For nearly 800 years, Christian Spain struggled to retake the territory. When Granada finally fell in 1492, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel, at first guaranteed the defeated Moors religious freedom, but then reneged on their promise. When in 1502, the crown declared that all Castilians must be Christians, many Moors outwardly converted, but practiced their religion in secret. Over the years, the Spanish monarchy attempted to define the nation as Christian by excluding Moriscos and conversos, that's converts from Judaism, from certain civil and religious positions by means of statutes of limpieza de sangre, or blood purity statutes. However, as Barbara Fuchs argues, blood purity was not so easy to establish. The subjects in question were not physically distinguishable from their neighbors and were often quite deliberately unreadable. Despite the crown's efforts to eradicate them, Moorish practices and Moorish influence was so deeply embedded in Spanish life that it did not disappear with the royal edicts. Fuchs shows that in many aspects of Spanish life, including games, foods, and fashion, which Spanish themselves saw as local or regional, these things were recognized by people outside of Spain, by foreign travelers, for example, as exotic or non-European. The heavy taxation, persecution, and discrimination to which the Moors were subjected led to a Morisco uprising in Alpujarras, it's a region of Granada, from 1568 to 1571. When the crown finally managed to put down the rebellion, many Moriscos were expelled from Spain, resettled in Castile, or even enslaved. Eventually, the monarchy's misgivings led to drastic measures. In 1609, King Philip III expelled the Moriscos from Spain. Widespread distrust of Moors becomes for Cervantes both a source of humor and a key to his exploration of one of the major issues of Don Quixote: what constitutes truth? Cide Hamete is a constant throughout both books of the two-book history, the first appearing in 1605 and the second in 1615. Like the narrator, he is an unreliable source, the butt of a running joke about the deceitfulness of Arabs. If any objection can be raised regarding the truth of this account, says the narrator, it can only be that its author was Arabic, since the people of that nation are very prone to telling falsehoods. Early in Book 2, Don Quixote laments that his story has been recounted by a Moor because Moors are known to be dishonest. It made him disconsolate to think that its author was a Moor, and one could not expect the truth from the Moors because all of them are tricksters, liars, and swindlers. This running joke provides Cervantes a means to experiment with traditional approaches to fiction. Narrators of fictional works are usually considered to be omniscient. Although we know their stories are fabrications, we suspend disbelief and take them at their word. However, not only does Cervantes present us with a narrator who withholds information and relies on multiple conflicting sources, he then introduces a fictional author who is less reliable still because he is a Moor. To complicate matters still further, the narrator will have access to Benengeli's notebooks only through a Morisco translator, whose text will not reflect the exact sense of the original manuscript because a translation is always an interpretation. In addition, throughout the novel, many other characters narrate their stories within the context of their own encounters with Don Quixote. The real or empirical author of Don Quixote, Cervantes himself, withdraws from his own novel to leave the narration in the hands of others, all fictitious. This discursive stratification forces the reader constantly to question the validity of the text. Tricks like interrupting the story in mid-adventure because the source material has run out remind the reader that even as the novel draws us into Don Quixote's story and holds us in its thrall, it is a work of fiction. As Jesus Maestro points out, we never see Benengeli's original manuscript or even the translator's text. The story we are reading is a compendium of fragments that have been filtered through several unreliable sources, then edited and presented to the public by an unreliable narrator. However, Cervantes explores not only traditional ways of reading fiction, but also the validity of the written word itself. Early modern Europe inherited a system of scholastic argumentation for approaching the truth. Through dialectical reasoning, scholars used a series of propositions or theses and contrasting positions, antitheses, to arrive at a conclusion, usually citing established authorities from antiquity or the early church. This method gave authority to the written word. However, in the prologue to Don Quixote, Cervantes rejects a fictional friend's suggestion that he fill his book with citations so that readers will take it seriously. I'm by nature too lazy and slothful to go looking for authors to say what I know very well how to say without them. Graduate students should take note of this. By the time Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, Europe was transitioning into a new era that valued experimentation, evidence, logic, and proof over mere words, and even over superficial observation. The sense of incertitude that permeates Don Quixote reflects a general unease that characterized late 16th century Europe. The Protestant Reformation threw into doubt age-old beliefs about the church as the undisputed source of truth. Luther's 95 Theses cast doubt on what constituted valid authority and created turmoil in much of the continent. At the same time, the scientific revolution occurring mainly in Northern Europe wore away at long-held beliefs on the nature of the world and the universe. The Spanish crown responded in to the new ways of thinking by imposing strict censorship laws to control the impact of unorthodox ideas. Spain remained staunchly Catholic, but a sense of instability led to questioning in many areas of Spanish life. The political and economic failures of the crown eroded confidence in the government. Hypocrisy on all levels of society produced the sense that the world was a jumble of mere appearances. Engaño y desengaño, deceit and awakening to reality, became a major theme in literature and philosophy. The notion that things are never as they appear was a leitmotif in Spanish Baroque literature and art. In Don Quixote, Cervantes adopts a position that seems almost postmodern in the importance it places on the subjective. When Don Quixote sees giants instead of windmills, these giants are real to him, because in the chivalric world he has constructed for himself, giants, not windmills, have a place. And yet, what seems absolutely real to him seems an illusion to everyone else. In Cervantes' novel, mindsets are constantly at odds with one another. Don Quixote derives his belief system from words, from the books of chivalry in which Christian knights prevail and good triumphs over evil. His utopian worldview embraces immutable truths encapsulated in the pursuit of justice, beauty, and Christian ideals. Throughout the novel, Don Quixote clashes not only with objective reality, but with alternate belief systems. For example, in one episode, he comes across some merchants and demands that they accept unquestioningly the perfection of his lady love, Dulcinea. Down-to-earth businessmen used to dealing with numbers and merchandise, they teasingly demand proof, a likeness, for example. But Don Quixote bursts into a rage. If I were to show her to you, he says, where would be the virtue in your confessing to so obvious a truth? The significance lies in not seeing her and believing, confessing, affirming, swearing, and defending that truth. Don Quixote sees the world in terms of absolutes. There can be no middle ground. He represents what John O'Malley calls the prophetic culture. The prophet, explains O'Malley, sees things antithetically: grace, sin, goodness, corruption, with no room for anything in between. When Don Quixote comes across a group of enchained galley slaves, he becomes indignant because, according to Christian doctrine, God has given man free will, and that freedom cannot be compromised. Sancho explains that the men are being punished for their misdeeds, but in Don Quixote's mind, there is no room for contextualization. The truth, as he sees it, is simply that God made man free. Since the guards are depriving the prisoners of their freedom, Don Quixote liberates them. But when he does, they beat him up and run away. They do not share his worldview with its system of immutable truths. The complex narrative fabric of the novel, the unreliable narrator, the untrustworthy Moorish author, the necessarily defective translator, constantly jolts the reader into a state of questioning. At first read, Don Quixote's liberation of the galley slaves appears to be folly. But the would-be knight errant actually grasps a deeper truth than that represented by Spanish law. In fact, in this episode, Cervantes calls into question the whole structure of the Spanish legal system. The men Don Quixote liberates have committed crimes. And according to the law, that is the system of rules that deemed reasonable to keep a society functioning smoothly, they have been rightly punished. Both the judges who have condemned them and the guards who hold them act reasonably. But their worldview is far more rigid and flawed than Don Quixote's. When Don Quixote interrogates each of the prisoners, he learns that although they have indeed broken laws, the underlying reasons for their behavior are social inequity and judicial corruption. Poverty drove one to steal, and the lack of funds to bribe the court clerk caused another to be imprisoned. Others confessed under torture. Every time we think we grasp a situation, a conflicting truth emerges that forces us to stop and re-examine our beliefs. The frequent mention of Cide Hamete, the lying Moor, plays an important role in repeatedly nudging us back into a state of uncertainty. On the one hand, writes William Eggington, Cervantes is claiming for his story the status of history and hence truth. On the other hand, he is questioning the veracity of its source and as an Arabic historian. And he is doing both within the margins of a story that is patently untrue. For Maestro, Cide Hamete is, like the rest of the fictitious authors in Don Quixote, a narrative device, a character who serves the rhetorical design of the narrative system. But he is also much more than that. Ruth El-Safar argues that Cide Hamete Benengeli not only relates another character's story, but is himself an interesting character. He appears throughout both books of Don Quixote, and in book 2, he is identified as first author and develops as a persona. The narrator who tells the story maintains a distance from the protagonist. The narrator is also an editor. He sifts through the material supplied by Benengeli and his Morisco translator and produces a readable text, and he supplies the titles and the synopses that precede each chapter. He also comments on the action, but his remarks are often cynical or ironic. As Maestro points out, in contrast to the narrator, Cide Hamete follows the tradition of the fictitious chroniclers of chivalric novels. His voice is hyperbolic and dynamic, with no pretense to measured objectivity. Cide Hamete's interventions heighten the comedy of the narrative because they are so extravagant. Because we have been told repeatedly that Moors are liars, we tend not to take anything he says seriously. But like many other characters and events in Don Quixote, how Cide Hamete is perceived depends on the viewer's perspective. For example, at the beginning of book 2, Don Quixote laments that his story has been told by a prevaricating Moor. But when Sanson Carrasco, the town intellectual, tells him that the publication of book 1 has made him famous, Don Quixote responds, "So then it is true that my story exists and that it was composed by a wise Moor." Now that he has achieved the renown he craves, he is no longer concerned that Cide Hamete is the principal source of his story. On the contrary, Don Quixote sees Cide Hamete as a wise rather than as a deceitful Moor when it suits him. Sancho describes Cide Hamete as fair-minded because in addition to Quixote's glorious deeds, the Moor mentions his defeats, the infinite beatings given to Señor Don Quixote in various encounters. Don Quixote argues that he would have preferred for these embarrassing incidents to be omitted, but Sancho sees Benengeli's decision to include them as an indication of his objectivity. "That's where the truth of the story comes in," responds Sancho. Rather than as a falsifier, Sancho sees the Moor as an objective historian. Although Cide Hamete is a Moor, his religion does not impede him from showering blessings on Don Quixote and Sancho. Chapter 8 of Book 2 begins, "Blessed be Almighty Allah. Blessed Allah." He repeats 3 times and says he gives these blessings as seeing that now Don Quixote and Sancho are in the countryside where their adventures are about to recommence. Neither the narrator nor Don Quixote seem offended by the Moor's calling on Allah. On the contrary, Cide Hamete's prayer heightens our sense of his affection for his protagonist. Allah is used repeatedly in Don Quixote by both Moorish and Christian characters in its true Arabic sense, as simply a name for God. In chapter 27 of Book 2, the narrator tells us, Cide Hamete, the chronicler of this great story, begins his chapter with the words, I swear as a Catholic Christian, to which the translator says that Cide Hamete swearing as a Catholic Christian when he is a Moor meant only that just as a Catholic Christian, when he swears or should swear the truth and tell the truth in everything he says, so too, he was telling the truth as if he were swearing as a Catholic Christian when he wrote about Don Quixote. The Morisco translator is struggling to extricate Cide Hamete from a religious quagmire and winds up in a very funny muddle of doublespeak. Still, the passage illustrates how intricately entwined Christian and Moorish culture were in early modern Spain. The implication is that a Moor, as well as a Christian, can tell the truth, and that religious devotion can be sincere for people of different faiths. However, in the Spain of Philip III, Cervantes had to tread carefully. The incident Cide Hamete is describing is that of a soothsaying monkey, which is obviously a scam, so the Moor's oath cannot be valid. Although Cide Hamete often speaks in hyperbole, he is also capable of discernment. In Book 2, chapters 22 to 24, Don Quixote claims to descend into the cave of Montesinos, a mysterious grotto where he meets many of the famous knights he has read about, as well as Dulcinea. Don Quixote's description of these fictional characters are clearly elaborations of scenes from literature, or else drawn from his imagination. Some are so far-fetched that Cide Hamete must stop and wonder about them. The man who translated this story from the original composed by the first author, Cide Hamete Benengeli, says that when he reached the chapter concerning the adventure of the cave of Montesinos, he found in the margin, written in Hamete's own hand, these precise words, I cannot believe, nor can I persuade myself, that everything written in the preceding chapter actually happened. The reason is that all the adventures up to this point have been possible and plausible. But with regard to this one in the cave, I can find no way to consider it true, since it goes far beyond the limits of reason. The Moor's ability to stand back from the narration and question this episode for its lack of verisimilitude adds depth to the character. Cide Hamete is, after all, a man of judgment. At the end of the book, Cide Hamete reveals another very human characteristic, authorial pride, that expresses itself in authentic affection for his creation. For me was Don Quixote born, he writes, and I for him. He knew how to act, and I to write. He speaks of Don Quixote with love, praising the undertakings that have brought so much delight and pleasure to so many readers, and says goodbye as though to an old friend. Although not fully developed as an acting character, Cide Hamete nevertheless integrates the complexities and contradictions of the human condition. He is eccentric, but wise, hyperbolic, yet fair, credulous, yet doubtful, dedicated to and proud of his work. Cervantes uses the stereotype of the lying Moor precisely to show through humor just how complex and multifaceted every human being is. Whether the narrator and Don Quixote refer to Cide Hamete, when the narrator and Cide Hamete refer to, when the narrator and Don Quixote refer to Cide Hamete as a liar, they are not articulating experiences of an actual cultural encounter. They are echoing cultural bias. More than a mockery of Moors, Cervantes's ethnic jokes are a mockery of the prejudices that permeate Spanish society. Some of the cultural encounters between Christians and Moors that Cervantes describes reflects the author's own personal experience. Chapters 39 to 41 of Book 1 constitute an intercalated novel known as The Captive's Tale. And parts of this are surely autobiographical. Cervantes was captured by Barbary pirates and sold into slavery in Algeria in 1675. After several attempts at escape, he was finally ransomed in 1580. The protagonist of The Captain's Tale is fighting with the Holy League against the Turks when, by a fluke, he finds himself a prisoner in Algiers. There, in a baño, or house where Christians are held captive, he catches sight of a beautiful young woman, Zoraida, through a window overlooking the courtyard. The daughter of the wealthy owner of the estate, Ajimorato, Zoraida initiates contact with the captive by sending him pieces of gold and a note in which she explains her desire to become a Christian. As a child, she had a slave nursemaid who taught her about Leila Marién, the Virgin Mary. When the woman died, says Zoraida in her note, I know she did not go to the fire, but to Allah, because afterward I saw her 2 times, and she told me to go to a Christian land to see Leila Marién, who loved me very much. With the help of the renegade, an Arabic-speaking Spaniard who became Muslim and now wishes to return to Christianity, the captive responds, May the true Allah keep you, Senora, and blessed Marianne. His letter ends, May Allah and his mother Marianne bless and keep you. Although the Moors in this story are acting characters, they share certain features with Cide Hamete. One is the ease with which they blend the languages of Islam and Christianity. References to God as Allah, to Mary as Marianne, and to hell as a place of fire, a notion held by both Christians and Muslims, suggest a blurring rather than a clash of religions. Another is the element of uncertainty they introduce into the narration. All of them are distinguished in one way or another. Zoraida, dressed as a Moor, all of them are disguised in one way or another. Zoraida, dressed as a Moor, but with the heart of a Christian, is not what she seems. If Cide Hamete causes the reader to question the narration because of prevalent ethnic prejudices against Arabs, these characters force the reader to seek the truth beyond appearances. Zoraida makes it known to the captive that she wishes to be called Maria and go to Spain to be baptized. She manages to steal enough gold from her father for the renegade to negotiate their escape abroad. When she and the men appear at the inn where Don Quixote and his entourage have gathered, everyone recognizes her as a Moor. Yet despite the distrust of Moors that is being promoted by the crown, no one rebuffs Zoraida. On the contrary, Dorotea and Lucinda, characters from previous episodes, receive her graciously and offer her lodgings. The women surmise from her gestural signs of gratitude that she only speaks Arabic, yet do not think to rescind their offer. Tell me, Senor, Dorotea says to the captive, is this lady a Christian or a Moor? Her dress and her silence make us think she is what we would rather she was not. Despite echoing the requisite wariness of Muslims, the 2 women maintain a cordial attitude toward Zoraida. No one doubts her sincerity. No one doubts her conversion when the captive explains she is a Moor in her dress and her body, but in her soul she is a devout Christian because she has a very strong desire to be one. Although Zoraida has not been baptized, her insistence on being called Maria instead of by her Arabic name reinforces the others' conviction of her sincerity. Rather than bombard her with questions, they bid her go and rest. She elicits unquestioned admiration and devotion. She is an exemplary Morisca who was accepted immediately into Spanish society, unlike the captive and the renegade who must appear before the Inquisition in Granada to be reinstated into the church. She is an example of the kind of religious transvestitism Barbara Fuchs discusses in Passing for Spain. In this case, a Christian at heart dressed as a Moor, although in the complex weave of Christians of Spanish society, the term could also be used to refer to a Muslim passing for Christian. The poignancy of Zoraida's story stems not only from her conversion, but from her devotion to her Muslim father. What distinguishes Zoraida is her unwillingness to repudiate Aji Morato, even as she steals his gold to make her escape. Although Zoraida may be a sincere Christian, her means of realizing her conversion are saturated with deceit. She pilfers her father's treasure, helps the Spaniards plan an escape route, secretly dresses for travel, and sneaks out of the house. In the eyes of the early 17th century Spanish reader, her perfidy is mitigated by her desire to embrace Christianity. Still, the situation is thorny. Zoraida is tormented by conflicting feelings. Hearing her father's wails as she boards the boat that will take her to Spain, she is acutely aware of the pain her betrayal is causing him. When the captive restrains Aji Morato, she begs him to set her father free because, quote, she would throw herself into the ocean rather than see with her own eyes the father who had loved her, taken prisoner on her account. She is so deeply moved that she hides her head to avoid looking at him. Zoraida is a complex character, both headstrong and compassionate, both rash and naive. An unmarried woman, she consents to travel to a foreign country with two men, unaccompanied by a female servant, a step as inappropriate for a virtuous Christian damsel as for a sheltered Muslim one, her only defense being her devotion to the Virgin Mary. And although she expresses remorse over the sorrow that she has caused her father, she never considers easing his pain by changing her plans or begging him to accompany her. Like all human dilemmas, Zoraida's is complex and nuanced, not black and white. Significantly, Cervantes' compassion seems to lie with Aji Morato as much as with Zoraida. The response of the Moor to the loss of his daughter reflects closely Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, although we do not know that he ever reaches the last stage. At least, at first, Aji Morato assumes the Spaniards have taken Zoraida by force. He cannot believe that she has willingly fled her home. He is in a state of denial. However, when he sees her dressed in all her finery and spies the coffer where she keeps her jewels in the boat, he realizes she is leaving of her own free will. He is so overcome with rage at her betrayal that he throws himself into the sea. After the Spaniards rescue him and the renegade explains that Zoraida has converted to Christianity, Aji Morato explodes in anger. He lashes out at Zoraida, accusing her of wanting to pursue a lewd lifestyle in a Christian land. But then he is filled with remorse and seeks to bargain for her return. Come back, my beloved daughter. Come back. Come ashore. I forgive everything. Give those men the money. It is already theirs. And come and console your grieving father. However, in questions of faith, there can be no compromise, and therefore no acceptance, at least not within the episode. Cervantes does not tell us what happens to Aji Morato after Zoraida leaves. In the end, Zoraida begs her father to pray to Allah that Leila Marién will enlighten him, but she leaves him alone, distraught, unable to comprehend her decision, yet ever the loving father, struggling to understand his lost daughter. In his portrayal of Aji Morato, Cervantes captures the Moor's humanity: love, loss, pain, grief. These are human realities that transcend religion and ethnicity. We are left with the sense that Aji Morato is simply a father, grieving for the daughter he knows he will never see again. In Book 2, Chapter 54, Cervantes introduces another father-daughter pair, Ricote and Ana Felix, both in disguise. Published in 1615, 6 years after the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609, Book 2 reveals a distinct awareness of the consequences of the anti-Morisco policies of Philip III. Through the story of Ricote and his daughter, Cervantes examines the situation of the expelled population and the psychological costs for the victims. On the road, Sancho Panza runs across his former neighbor, Ricote, a Morisco. Ricote is returning to Spain, traveling with a group of German pilgrims who are begging along the way. Ricote is so changed that at first, Sancho does not recognize him. "How is it possible, my brother Sancho Panza," says Ricote, "that you don't know your neighbor Ricote, the Morisco, a shopkeeper in your village?" Sancho is astounded at his friend's transformation. "Tell me," he says, "who turned you into a foreigner? And why did you risk coming back to Spain? It'll be very dangerous for you if they catch you and recognize you." Sancho's warning is well-founded. Internal passports were required to travel from one region of Spain to another, so travelers were constantly forced to show documentation. For Moriscos discovered in the country after 1609, possible punishments were the forfeit of property, imprisonment, torture, or even death. Ricote explains how the proclamation and edict that His Majesty issued against those of my race brought terror and fear to us all. I saw clearly that those proclamations were not mere threats, as some were saying, but real laws that would be put into effect at the appointed time. He left Spain and settled in Germany, but has now returned to Spain to recover some gold that he had hidden near his house. Burying property in defiance of the law had serious consequences. Article 4 of the first decree of expulsion states, if there were any attempts to hide or bury property, all the inhabitants of the village in question became subject to the death penalty. By defying the authorities, Ricote has put not only his family, but his entire village in danger. Cervantes was taking a risk in his depiction of Ricote, whom he describes with great sympathy. The Moriscos who were expelled had roots going back nearly 800 years. Cervantes is careful to have Ricote justify Philip III's decision, while at the same time emphasizing the human suffering it has caused. Quoting Ricote, "It was divine inspiration that moved His Majesty to put into effect sober resolution, not because all of us were guilty, but for some of us were firm and true Christians, though these were so few they could not oppose those who were not. But because it is not a good idea to nurture a snake in your bosom or shelter enemies in your house." This ambivalence between the need to protect Spain from its enemies and the inhumanity of the king's policy is a leitmotif in Ricote's story. It was just and reasonable for us to be chastised with the punishment of exile, lenient and mild according to some. But for us, it was the most terrible one we could have received. No matter where we are, we weep for Spain. For after all, we were born here, and it is our native country. We did not know our good fortune until we lost it. And the greatest desire in almost all of us is to return to Spain. While he admits that few Moriscos are true Christians, he insists that all are true Spaniards whose suffering at the loss of their homeland is excruciating. Ricote confesses that he himself is not a very devout Christian, but he is more Christian than Moor, while his wife and daughter are true Catholic Christians. Sometime later in the novel, Ricote will be reunited with his daughter, Ricota, now called Ana Felix. In a later episode, Sancho is visiting a galley when the captain catches sight of a Moorish pirate ship at a distance. The galley captain engages the pirates, resulting in a skirmish, and it turns out that the captain of the pirate ship is Ana Felix, who left Spain due to the decree of expulsion and now plans to return to find the treasure her father buried. Ricote, who is on the ship, recognizes his daughter, and the two contrive to rescue Ana's beloved, Don Gregorio, who remains stranded in Algiers. The disguises that distinguish the characters in this story are not only a manifestation of the engaño-desengaño theme so prevalent in Spanish Baroque literature, the notion that appearances are deceiving, but of a deeper historical reality. In early modern Spain, Moriscos who dressed as and passed for Christian Spaniards engaged in a kind of cultural transvestitism that I mentioned before, but it made them seem dangerous to the crown. Every Morisco, no matter how culturally assimilated, was suspect. However, in the case of Ricote and his daughter, the phenomenon is reversed. Although they are dressed as foreigners, inside they are Spaniards. Their disguises are emblematic of the alienation experienced by Moriscos, whose souls continue to belong to Spain. In addition, Ana Felix is disguised as a man, for it is only as a Christian man that she can exercise the agency that she needs in order to rescue Don Gregorio and the recuperation of the family treasure. Thanks to Ana Felix's beauty and the sincerity of her faith, the authorities arranged for her and her family to remain in Spain, an implausible conclusion to a very believable dilemma. As Fuchs pointed out, in Ricota and Ana Felix, Cervantes gives us highly sympathetic characters whose uncertain status within Spain simply cannot be resolved. An estimated 300,000 Moriscos were affected by the decree of expulsion, although only about 100,000 or 150,000 were thought to have left. The plight of those who stayed or who left and returned presented an unresolvable problem for the crown, as it was often nearly impossible to distinguish old Christian Spaniards, that is, those with no Moorish blood, from Moriscos. Throughout Don Quixote, Cervantes shows compassion for the outsider. Don Quixote himself is an outsider, eccentric, old, dogmatic, with a worldview that sets him up for ridicule, but also serves to expose the corruption and injustice endemic in his society. Cervantes may have been sensitive to the plight of the outsider because he himself was, many scholars believe, of converso background. Cervantes uses the negative stereotype of moriscos to pose important epistemological questions. However, his Moorish characters are more than tools for philosophical exploration. Cervantes treats each one of them humanely and as an individual. Each one has a personality and a distinct voice. Each one is a multifaceted being. The active characters also have a context, a story that reveals the complexities and contradictions of the human condition, the choices people must make in difficult situations, and the conflicting passions that torment them. By humanizing his Moorish characters, Cervantes defies prevailing stereotypes. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. That's a really wonderful talk, and raised a lot of questions in my own mind. If anybody's got questions, please feel free to send them in now. And I see Mike Collins is joining us. You say at one point, every time we think we grasp a situation, a conflicting truth emerges that forces us to stop and re-examine our beliefs. Do you think that's what Cervantes wanted to do? That was his aim within the novel as a whole?
I think that was one of his aims. I mean, it's always dangerous to try to read the mind of an author, but there's so many instances where this happens. For example, there's another episode where Don Quixote and Sancho are in an inn, and Maritornes, who is a very unattractive woman, she's a prostitute, she's a hunchback, and she has an appointment with a mule driver in the lodgings where Don Quixote is staying, and she comes into the room, and Don Quixote sees her, and he's convinced that she's a princess, and she and he comes upon her, and he says, "Oh, beautiful princess," and he practically attacks her, and so he thinks she's a princess. The mule driver, who sees the situation from another perspective, thinks that she, as a prostitute, has an appointment with Don Quixote, which isn't true. And Sancho Panza hears all the commotion. He wakes up and he thinks somebody's attacking him, and that's not true. And then the police come. The Guardia Civil, what would be the equivalent of the Guardia Civil, comes, and they think Don Quixote is causing this ruckus in a different way. Everybody misinterprets the situation. So the question is, who is right? Who sees the situation as it really is? And as you read the story, well, you know that Don Quixote is wrong, but the mule keeper. When I ask my students, they say, "Who sees the situation correctly?" And the students always say the mule keeper, but the mule keeper or the mule driver, but they're wrong, because that's not what's happening at all. So as more information is added, we realize that we're wrong, that we're misreading the signs, and that happens all the time in Don Quixote. And I think that what Cervantes is doing is kind of playing with our perceptions when we think things are a certain way. We can be wrong. We can possibly be wrong. We don't question ourselves because we live in our bubble of beliefs, but we can be wrong. There's another situation in Don Quixote where there's a young boy, Andres, who he's keeping the sheep, and he loses a sheep, and the owner of the sheep comes and he beats him. So according to the law, who is right? Who is reasonable? Right? The owner is right, because the law is on his side. But Don Quixote is indignant, and he turns against this man, and he makes him apologize. And so we're seeing it from different angles. But then what happens later, much later, is that Don Quixote runs into the boy, and the boy has escaped from this man, and it turns out that the man has come back later and beaten him even harder. Everything that we think is open to question. I won't say it's wrong, but Don Quixote is a dogmatist. He doesn't question any of his beliefs. But a wise man or woman questions his beliefs or her beliefs.
Very interesting. Very contemporary as well, to be perfectly honest.
It is. You know, at the beginning of Don Quixote, Don Quixote decides to test his armor. He's about to go out on his first sally, and he decides he's found this old armor in his house. You know, he's got all this stuff lying around, and he decides to test his helmet to see if it'll stand up under an attack. So he starts throwing things at it, and he starts testing it. And as it turns out, it doesn't. So he ties it together, he glues it together, and then instead of giving up on the armor, he gives up on the testing. So he wants it to work. He wants it to be a helmet, and he wants it to be a good helmet, and he's going to believe that it is, and he's not going to put it to the test.
That sounds contemporary politics as well.
But I think a wise person puts his or her beliefs to the test.
Yeah. Mike Collins, do you want to say anything? You're muted at the moment, Mike.
Yeah, Mike is muted.
Probably just as well that I'd be muted. What I would have asked if there had been time is, are there any comparable encounters with, I think the word is convertos, the people who converted from Judaism to Christianity?
There aren't. There are
not.
There are not. There are not. There are oblique mentions of conversos. For example, when the narrator finds the Arabic text, he says, it was easy for me to find someone who could translate this text for me. And even if I had had a text in an older language, I would have been able to find someone to translate it. The older language, of course, is, I guess, Hebrew,
Aramaic.
or Aramaic, or what. But he doesn't. But he doesn't. He never mentions the word converso. The word converso doesn't appear.
Yeah, interesting. I think we're going to have to wind it up there. Thank you, Barbara, for such an in-depth and insightful session of such a major work. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience has as well. Can I thank Georgetown University for supporting the series, especially Tom Banchoff, President of Global Affairs, and our administrator, Mary Gordon. I'd also like to thank Blackfriars Hall for their support, especially Dominic White, the new prior, John O'Connor, the regent, and Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, and their UK administrator, John Angus Macaulay. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. My thanks again to Bárbara Mujica. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Mike, for joining us. And can I thank also my wife, Maggie, for helping with the administration back here in Oxford.